Is everything okay? Are we ready to go, Sandra? Okay. So our guests, I'm delighted that you are joining us today here at the center, as well as our guests who are also joining us remotely. It's a privilege for us to have you here today to attend this event on Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, which is known as SIPA, Master of Public Administration in Development Practice session. Today's session will feature an insightful talk on food security, which is also an area that I'm very passionate about personally. My name is Murugi Dirango, and I am currently serving as the director of Columbia Global Center, Nairobi, where we are today. CGC Nairobi, as it is popularly known, is part of Columbia Global, a global initiative that was established by Columbia University in New York to nurture positive change in our dynamic 21st century world. Columbia Global brings together other entities, including Columbia World Projects, the Institute of Ideas and Imagination that is based in Paris, and the Committee on Global Thought, as well as, of course, the Columbia Global Centers. Columbia Global leverages the remarkable scholarship, expertise, and resources of Columbia University to address the world's most complex challenges. The Columbia Global Centers specifically are a network of 11 global centers in Africa, South America, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The network advances knowledge and fosters global engagement through interdisciplinary research, education, and practice. In particular, our center in Nairobi facilitates collaboration between Columbia University and diverse stakeholders across Eastern and Southern Africa. Through formulating strategic partnerships, we connect academic institutions, government bodies, NGOs, multinationals, and other entities to join forces with Columbia faculty, students, and alums to address pressing regional challenges and to foster meaningful change. We work to ensure that our programs align with the interests of our region here in Southern and Eastern Africa. And this has seen us work across a range of themes, including climate, health, education, refugee and migration, and business, among others. Additionally, with the different schools from Columbia, we work to encourage African students to study at Columbia. We believe the scholarship and resources available at Columbia University will prepare students to be 21st global citizens equipped to address today's most pressing challenges in Africa and the world. In today's session, you will have the opportunity to learn practical ways on how theory turns to practice through SIPA's Master of Public Administration in Development Practice program. Let me now introduce our keynote speaker today. Professor Glenn Denning is the director of the Master of Public Administration in Development Practice, which is also known as the MPA-DP program at Columbia University, SIPA. He is a thought leader in food security and global development. In today's talk, Glenn will draw on insights from his latest book, Universal Food Security: How to End Hunger While Protecting the Planet. He will illustrate how science, policy, and practice can unite effectively to eliminate hunger while safeguarding our planet. Additionally, he will highlight the strong connection between his book and the MPA-DP program's emphasis on practical applications. By exploring the issue of universal food security today, you will learn how achieving a food secure world free from hunger and malnutrition transforms how our food is grown, managed, and distributed. Glenn joined Columbia's SIPA in 2009 as a founding director of the Masters of Public Administration in Development Practice, a joint undertaking of SIPA with Columbia University's Earth Institute, then today's Climate School. He teaches core universal food security and sustainable development policy and practice courses. From 2011 to 2014, Glenn was director of the Earth Institute Center on Globalization and Sustainable Development. Before joining SIPA, Glenn helped establish the MDG Center, Eastern and Southern Africa in Nairobi, Kenya, serving as its founding director from 2004 to 2009. And let me say that the Global Center in Nairobi is actually built on the skeleton that was established by Glenn as the MDG Center. So we grew out of that. As I conclude, I encourage our audience online and also here in person to keep their questions available for Glenn to answer so that you'll be able to really get a good understanding of his views on the book as well as the program. Additionally, I would like to also invite you to think about ways that we can partner with the Global Center here we are always open to ideas on how to collaborate in more initiatives for the future. So I thank you for your attention. And at this point, let me invite Glenn to come and make his presentation. Glenn, please.
See if this works. So anyway, asante sana for the kind introduction, and thanks to everyone who's here at the Columbia Global Center, Nairobi, all part of Columbia Global. I think it's a wonderful initiative of the university to spread its wings. It always has done that, of course, probably since its earliest days, but I think now more important perhaps than ever, Columbia needs to be out in the world. So the Columbia Global Centers, I think, play a really important role. And I guess Nairobi was, if not the first, one of the first, and now we have 11 of those centers. So with that, I think I'm ready to roll. So let me start. So as mentioned by Marugi, I'm going to talk about food security. That's really my area of strength, my area of interest. But in addition, I'll talk a little bit about and make connections to the program itself. That's if I ever get these slides working, because I seem to be on something other than, let me try that. Yeah, that looks better. Let me see. No, I think we're good now. Let me see if I can move it forward. I can. So thanks for joining, everyone. I'm going to talk about universal food security. It will be very much a global perspective, but from time to time, I'll home in on what I think is the greatest relevance to Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa. So let's start with a definition of food security, because those two words are rolled out all of the time. What do we really mean by that? The best definition that I've come across was actually came out of a global conference in 1996 in Rome, and it was the 1996 Rome Declaration on World Food Security, and it was basically the idea that all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. Not any food, but sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs, their food preferences, so they can live an active and healthy life. That's a bit of a mouthful there, but I think the key thing to remember, all people at all times, right? That's what food security is. And it does include nutrition, right? So I distilled that down to a shorter definition here. And what I like to think of food security, and particularly the idea or the concept of universal food security, is a world where every person enjoys a healthy diet derived from sustainable food systems. So the universal, every person, right? Every person, healthy diet, and that diet would come from sustainable food systems. Now, why universal? Well, because food security or food is a human right. It was embodied in the 1948 UN Declaration on Human Rights, the 1966 Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. As I said, 1996 Declaration on Food Security, and no less than Agenda 2030, the SDGs, the idea that no one would be left behind. So that's why I really homed in on the idea of universal food security. So apply that to Africa, and what we're looking at is a continent where everyone, every single person enjoys a healthy diet coming from sustainable food systems. Now, why is that important? It's probably obvious to anybody who joined this, this event today, but really there is nothing more basic than food. And as Josette Chiran said, the former director of the World Food Programme, if people don't have it, one of three things happen. They revolt, they migrate, or they die. Actually, more than that. Beyond that, they can become malnourished. They can survive but be malnourished. And this idea of stunting being a manifestation of food insecurity is extremely important, because stunting, reduced physical growth and cognitive capabilities will reduce the potential of a person to perform in school and ultimately in terms of a productive livelihood. So critically important to avoid stunting. Now, let's look at the, has Africa achieved universal food security? Well, of course not. We're nowhere near it. These are some of the numbers, and these are the numbers coming from the 2024 SOFI report. 300 million people, 20% of the population of Africa, face hunger. So that's calorie deprivation. So the definition of hunger per FAO is very much based on calories. The severity, or basically the prevalence of moderate to severe food insecurity, another indicator of hunger, it's 58% in Africa, and it's basically double the global average. The number of people who cannot afford a healthy diet, and that's a rather recent indicator of undernourishment, is 925 million people. I mean, that's about 2/3 of the population of the African continent. That was a number from 2022. Stunting in Africa is 30%, 31% in sub-Saharan Africa, so it's about the same. But there's great variation from Burundi, 57%, to Kenya, 18%. So there's a lot of variation both across countries within Africa, but within countries, there's a lot of variation as well. Overnutrition, overconsumption, consumption of unhealthy nutrients is a rising concern, and it's being frequently raised by WHO, the African Union, UNICEF. The double burden of malnutrition is the idea that many countries experience both undernutrition and overnutrition, as represented by principally overweight and obesity, but that in fact being translated into rising non-communicable diseases like diabetes and heart disease. And this is basically attributed to shifting diets from unrefined to highly refined foods, increased consumption of saturated fats and sugar, sedentary lifestyle, and reduced physical activity. And all of this is increasingly having effects on health and productivity of the population. So you've got this double burden going on. It's very interesting. We're sort of we're actually making some progress in terms of undernutrition, and addressing undernutrition, but we're making very little progress in controlling, reversing those trends towards overnutrition. The other side of the definition, or the other part of the definition, is healthy diets from sustainable food systems. And we do know that our food production system and our broader food distribution and consumption systems have very negative consequences on the environment. These are global numbers. Basically, the environmental footprint, agriculture essentially dominates our landscapes. Globally, 38%. It's probably about the same level within sub-Saharan Africa. Water extraction. Agriculture is the major user of fresh water extracted. So 70% of the fresh water that is extracted from rivers, from lakes, from groundwater is actually used for agriculture, is for domestic and industrial production. 25 to 40% of the Earth's surface is degraded. In agricultural land is even, the number would be much higher. And biodiversity loss is widespread, and greenhouse gas emissions. Energy gets a lot of focus, our energy systems, but the food system generates 1/3 of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, all right? So that's not just agriculture, it's agriculture plus. So put all of this together and we have essentially what I would call a red alert. And the UN has flagged this alert, that we have a global food crisis comprising both undernutrition, overnutrition, and corresponding environmental degradation. So food security is very much in the news. From China, the president declaring agriculture is a national security issue of extreme importance. India, last year, banned the export of non-basmati rice. It had huge effects around the world, including here in Africa. And this next slide gives you an indication. This map of Africa shows the different colors. The darker the color is, the greater the dependency of African consumers in terms of their imports on Indian rice production. So rice imports from India, when they were affected, these were the countries most seriously affected. So some of those countries get 80% of their rice from India, right? And so when India decided, and it was almost all non-basmati rice, which was the type of rice that was banned. Now the ban has been lifted, but it does tell us how vulnerable are food importing countries, and virtually every African country is a food importer, how vulnerable they are when our supply chains get. And we also saw it during the effects of the Ukraine-Russia crisis. So the take-home points from what I've been talking about up until now, we have a global food system that basically is not delivering in terms of well-being, both health and environment. This is a food system that is experiencing greater stresses and shocks caused by continuing growth in population, changing food demands, degradation of the environment, climate change, and of course, conflict. The poor and the marginalized are, of course, the most vulnerable to shocks in prices because they spend more of their income relatively on food. And it brings us to the point where a great transformation is not a time for mental improvements, it's a time for a transformation. And no question, when we think about Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, food security is and should remain front and center on the political and economic agenda. It's not, obviously, it's not just about farmers. Farmers are very important. Increasing urbanization, political and economic stability, with food security. So all good and well, we achieve universal food security. So that was the quest I went on a few years ago to really try to get down to the truth and to truly understand it. It actually started, I think it was 2014, 2014, when I was invited down to the UN to talk about what it would take, what would be needed for what was then called Sustainable Development Goal number 2, SDG 2. How do you actually achieve SDG 2? It really got me thinking about what would it take to do all of the good things SDG 2 says it will do. End hunger and malnutrition and support sustainable agriculture. So I went out searching for best practice. I looked at peer-reviewed literature, expert opinion, and also drew on 40 years of field experience that I had in different parts of the world, mostly Asia and Africa. One sort of principle that drove me was that I was really looking for answers related to the science, the context, the needs, and the rights, and not ideology. I tried to avoid ideological altogether because it is the science, the context, the needs, and the rights that should shape our decisions on both policies and on practices. So that led me to what I call Big Five areas of investment that would, I hope, lead to universal food security. A food system that's productive, profitable, inclusive, healthy, sustainable, resilient, and ethical. 7 characteristics of a food system that would be associated and lead us to universal food security. So these 5 areas, plus one area that I call cross-cutting investments, those 5 areas are principally within the food system. Cross-cutting investments are investments like investing more broadly in education and health systems, improving governance, supporting women's empowerment, not explicitly geared towards the food system, but nevertheless very important in supporting the transformation of the food system. So these 5 areas, I'll walk through these now: sustainable intensification, market infrastructure, post-harvest stewardship, healthy diets, and social protection. These are the big 5. These are 5 investment areas that, applied in context, can bring about the kinds of changes we're looking for to achieve universal food security. So the first one, sustainable intensification. For some of you out there, sustainable intensification, that sounds like an oxymoron almost. Like, how can you intensify but still be sustainable? Well, my point is, there is no alternative at this point, and I'll explain why. But the core idea of sustainable intensification is this: that you can produce more food, but with a reduced environmental impact and a reduced environmental footprint. Now, this particular graph, this map, if you take a look at it, it actually shows basically croplands around the world. So everything green there, basically, that represents crop production, the lighter green color. So the amount of crop producing land, has declined from about a little under half 1960 to under just a little over 0.24 of a hectare, and it's down below 0.2 of a hectare per person by 2050. What does this tell you? That, I mean, the amount of land available that leaves us with unconscious. Of course, we can expand the area of land. We could grow more crops, right? We could cut down more forests and until there aren't any more left. But the idea of sustainable intensification is, no, let's intensify the land that we've already brought into cultivation. And
that led me to really thinking hard, what does that mean? Because it doesn't mean going around every single plot of land and into it and trying to production out of every plot of land on the continent or the world. But these 5 areas. Now, in different settings, it's useful to increase farm output with increased input. And I'll give you an example later from Malawi, where simply varieties to a more basic nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer can double production. And so there are many parts of Sub-Saharan Africa where that can be done. There are other parts where we can be much efficient with our inputs, whether it's water or nutrients applied. We can actually maintain existing output with reduced environmental input. And that's through much smarter of our inputs. There are a lot of degraded land around the world, and there's a lot of degraded and neglected arable land within Sub-Saharan Africa. And that could be brought back into production, that could be rehabilitated through strategic use of inputs, including agroforestry. Now, there's going to be some places where we probably need to move out of agriculture. It just doesn't make sense, and it doesn't make sense in the face of climate change. And in some of these areas, we may essentially return to natural ecosystems if we can. And the 5th component is, let's look after the natural ecosystems that already exist. We do not need to cut down 1 more hectare of rainforest to produce the food we need to feed Africa and to feed the world. So that is not easy, right? Because people locally behave on their local interests and their direct interests in terms of food security and the like. But globally, it is possible. It's absolutely possible. And within Africa, it's possible to sustainably intensify if we think of it as a process in aggregate, all right? A process in aggregate, including all of these 5 areas here, leading us to more food and less environmental impact. This is one of the surprising things I found in my research over the last few years. When I first came to Africa, when I first came to Kenya, the reputation was that productivity in Africa was extremely low. It was way behind other parts of the world. In fact, it was even dipping, it was going down. But if we take a look at what's happened since 2004, and I took 2004 as the starting point for a major commitment to improve agricultural productivity across the continent, associated with what was called the uniquely African Green Revolution, which was promoted by Kofi Annan at that time. And in brief, what it tells us is that production of cereal crops, the major cereals across Sub-Saharan Africa, increased by 92% during the first 18 years. So taking us from 2004 up to 2022, where I had the most recent data that I have. Compare that with the first 18 years of the Green Revolution in Asia, which gets a lot of attention for its success. In fact, Africa's increase is greater than Asia's. So the Asian Green Revolution sort of started around the mid-60s, 1966. And if we take those first 18 years, increased 85% the cereal crops, rice and wheat mainly. Sub-Saharan Africa, 92%. Now, there is a difference. Almost all of Asia's increase came from increasing production on existing land. So it was intensification. In the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, it was a combination of intensification and extensification. So it did increase yields, but it also expanded agricultural land. So another example, I won't go into details, but a great example of that actually contributed to those very positive figures was the experience of Malawi. Malawi came in and subsidized fertilizers and promoted use of high-yielding maize varieties, and essentially was able to double production. Now, of course, population growth has continued, so it's not as if Malawi is out of the woods in terms of food security. But if you look at the difference, if you take 2005, 2006, which was the starting point of Malawi's own green revolution, you can see a tremendous difference. Those bars there represent production of maize, which is the main staple crop of the country. This particular figure is another interesting one, and again, we always hear reports of Africa is importing more and more food. In reality, the numbers don't quite back that up. Since about 2011 or so, it's been pretty flat. In fact, it started to decline. Now, that particular graph ends in 2019. So there has been a jump since then, largely associated with a lot of the problems around COVID, also problems related to importation and so on. But the thing is, I believe that the continent is still spending about $50 billion a year on food, importing food. And there's a lot of potential for improvements in productivity leading to reduction in the amount of food that is imported from other parts of the world. I'll skip that one and keep going. Just a little contrast. I was talking about cereals. What about root crops? A lot of African consumers and farmers are involved in root crop production, roots and tubers, cassava, for example. And you can see here that similarly, Africa's increase over those 18 years is higher than the increase for roots and tubers in Asia. Now, the big difference is that almost all of that increase in root crops in Africa was expansion of area. It was extensification. It was no increase in yield at all. So that tells us there's a lot of work to be done in terms of sustainable intensification in the root crops. Market infrastructure. Basically, market infrastructure means connecting farmers to markets. If you ever look at a map of roads and railroads in sub-Saharan Africa and compare that with India, you'll be shocked. There's a much lower density of transport infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot of that is linked to resource extraction. So much can be done and should be done to improve connectivity of agricultural land and farmers and their produce to urban consumers. Post-harvest stewardship is important because somewhere around 30% of the food that is produced in the world, 30% is not consumed. So we go to we do a wonderful job with sustainable intensification, but at the end of the day, 1/3 of it is not consumed. It's lost on the farm, often in storage, poor storage facilities, lack of refrigeration for perishable crops, in transport, in storage, in processing. So much can be done along the whole value chain, from the farm all the way through to the consumer. So it's both food loss and food waste. I talked a lot about healthy diets earlier on, and I gave a fairly negative picture, I suppose, about the state of nutrition in the world and in sub-Saharan Africa. But actually, we've been seeing some progress. Now, this particular graph here shows the prevalence of stunting. We've just picked out 3 countries, the prevalence of stunting in 3 countries from the year 2000 to 2022. And you can see it's at least heading in the right direction. 60%, there was, if you look at those, the top 2 is Ethiopia and Malawi. It's come down from about 60% to a little under 40%. In the case of Ghana, it's come from about 32% down well below 20%. So this is tremendous progress over 20 years, but it's still not good enough. These are the positive, these are the more successful examples we can show. But the truth is, when 40%, 30% of the population are stunted, that's 30% of the children under the age of 5 getting inadequate nutrition to live a healthy and productive life and to perform in school and all the rest, this is not a good foundation for prosperity or peace on the continent. So much more still has to be done on the nutrition side. Social protection, finally, the fifth area, social protection. This is all about how do we support people who are not able to meet their own food security through their own means. So it includes school meal programs. It includes various other forms of social safety nets, people who are in conflict situations, people who have left their homes in refugee camps and the like. This is social protection, to come in and support them with food security, because they don't have farms, they don't have incomes, they don't have what the rest of society has to achieve its food security. So social protection is a very important part. So these are the big five that I've been talking about. And, you know, they need to be applied in context. It's pretty clear why they're needed, right? These investments are needed. Not too many of you out there are going to argue that we don't really need post-harvest, or we don't really need market infrastructure. Of course we need these things, so the why is pretty clear. The what is increasingly clear. A lot of research has gone on, a lot of experience. We have a lot of successes in pockets here and there, and even some countries have been successful with their agricultural production, with their, you know, as I showed, with reducing stunting and rolling out effective social protection programs. But then it comes to the how. So how do you actually translate all of this into implementable programs? And that's where I sort of get to that in the final part of my book. And that's the hardest part, of course. Like, it's easy to say what we should do, but it's harder to say, now, how do we actually bring it about? What would you sit down with, I don't know, the president of a country and say, like, this is what we need to do, exactly what we need to do. Step 1, step 2, step 3. So I'm not really there yet. I'm still working on that. I've got a lot of ideas, and some of them are in the book. But what I do know, it's not just about government. It's yes, public sector, very important, national and international. Private sector, business, we cannot do this without private sector entrepreneurs at all levels. The third sector, the NGO communities, the philanthropies, and so on. I really feel universities have been left out of this process, being able to connect and be part of this transformation. I mean, we're doing our best as Columbia, but all universities, African universities in particular, need to be working much more closely with government, with the private sector, with the third sector, and ultimately, of course, individuals. So education of individuals to take actions that lead to change. Now, what does this all require in the end? And this is, you know, then we're starting to get more to the heart of the matter. Like, even if you say we need all these sectors, we need to work high level, you know, international level, national level, subnational level, grassroots level. We need to work at all these levels. But yes, but it takes people in the end. It takes individuals to step up and lead. So for me, at the end of it all, it was all about leadership. It was about people who understood these different areas of good governance, effective policies, how to mobilize the finance, how to build capacity, how to innovate, how to come up with new ideas, how to negotiate good outcomes, and how to communicate. So all of these areas, these ingredients of good leadership needed to be there in the public sector, at the top level, all the way down to the field, in business, in the NGO community, in the universities. So it's not only about presidents and prime ministers. It has to be through the whole system. But certainly somebody like the late Bingu wa Mutharika, who we worked with very closely in the early 2000s, he exemplified that leadership when he simply got tired, as he said, of going around with a begging bowl every year and asking the World Food Program to come and help us, you know, or USAID or whoever else is out there. He said, enough is enough. I'm not going to go down on my knees to beg for food. Let us grow the food ourselves. And indeed we have. And indeed they did. I showed you that earlier on. You know, it was pretty remarkable against all odds and against massive criticism from the World Bank, from all of the big donors who said, oh, he's subsidizing agriculture. We don't like that. That's not sustainable. It's a slippery slope. It's not sustainable. Extreme poverty, hunger, and stunting are also not sustainable. And, you know, we, you know, in supporting the policies of President Mutharika, and, you know, we felt that this was an investment in human capital. To me, in many ways, investing in agriculture was no different to investing in health and investing in education. Because without food, the levels of malnutrition and the potential for social disorder, disruption, conflict was really too great. So if you want to learn a little bit more about this, I've kind of given some highlights, some high points from the book. Let me know, anybody out there who's listening to this, if you can't find it and you don't know where to get it, send me an email and I'll make sure there's a way of getting it to you, okay? Because I want people to read this. And I also want you to give me feedback and to criticize it. If you say, this doesn't work where I am, let me know that. That's extremely important and I'll share it with others. So my final couple of slides, let me just say again, coming back to the idea of you know, why we're in this wonderful center for Columbia University. I'm from the School of International and Public Affairs, CIPA, and it's been a great honor to be the foundation director of a program called the MPA in Development Practice. We're now in our 16th year. I see a few of our graduates in the audience here this afternoon, which is wonderful. We have many in Nairobi and in other parts of the continent. In a nutshell, what do we try to do through this? It's a 2-year program. The idea is to provide the knowledge, the skills, and the networks to be a transformational leader. Now, it doesn't have to be in food security. A few of our students have picked it up and run with food security, but others have pursued humanitarian action and conflict resolution and energy and education and infrastructure, many, many different areas. But applying these core principles that run through our program, multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral approaches to problem solving. Those problems that we're talking about, extreme poverty, inequality, climate change, food insecurity, conflict, all of these complex problems do not have simple answers, and they need these kinds of approaches. We also are very committed from day one, putting good ideas into practice. This is not a degree in development studies. You will study development, but it's about development practice. And who knows, you can end up in the public sector, the private sector, or the third sector. You can start your own enterprise. It's a small program, 50 to 60 students per cohort. It's diverse in terms of gender, professional background, nationalities. We now have a track record. Columbia has been around since 1754, or 1754 is it, or 58, 54. CIPA's been around about 75 years. We've only been around 16 years, but 650 graduates have come out of the program. They're working in more than 70 countries, including many here in Kenya. We are STEM accredited, which means it's possible to, based on your visa type, to be able to spend 3 years doing professional training and additional work experience in the United States. We're also a participating institution of the joint World Bank, Japan World Bank graduate scholarship program, which is a fantastic scholarship program. We get a couple of students every year successful with that. So if you need more information, go to our website. Our associate director, Andre, can be contacted, or contact me, reach out to me directly. I'll be happy to respond to your questions. And that's it for now. I think I've probably gone well over my time, but I'll stop here and open it up to any questions that are coming online or from our audience here. Thank you. Okay, so who's going to ask the first question? Amanda, yeah. Do you want a microphone for her as well? Yeah.
Sure. My question is about universities and the role of universities in supporting universal food security. You mentioned it was very important and we're working out the how. Part of my work involves supporting universities in Africa on training them on climate risk management. I think there's a really big role that they have in supporting this foundational knowledge and skills, especially around use of, for example, climate information, but many other topics as well. I think there's some interesting programs, let me say, in the US, especially through the Department of State, to foster linkages between US universities, African universities, and things like that. And I think there's also there's some interesting initiatives that are existing, but I think that also a lot of assessments show that, you know, when you look at the programs at some of these universities that are touching on food security and climate, they're talking about maybe theoretically climate change. They're not really providing practical hands-on skills. And there's, I'll say, a lot that maybe could be done by way of fostering collaborations to advance these things in a more meaningful way. So my question is really, you know, I think, at least from what I see in my circles, people are waking up to the fact that universities have a really important role to play in supporting the capacities towards universal food security and climate adaptation and a lot of other things. But what could we do to accelerate that engagement from universities? I know Columbia Climate School's obviously trying to address this through its fourth purpose, but I was just curious what your thoughts were in terms of actually catalyzing more universities towards that space.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I have the answer to it. One of the problems is, there's a couple of problems. One is that universities historically have not been easy to change. Curricula and programs have often been set and have existed for a long time. And so being able to shift and create new schools and create new programs is not that easy. Universities, particularly in the global south, tend to be very poorly funded. Most of their money goes into salaries, and as a result, faculty and as a result, students are really hostage to whatever donors may be able to make available and their priorities. So I think it probably starts just simply with a recognition that of really analyzing how can universities help, and I think the knowledge part of it is important. I think building capacity of institutions outside of the university, like actually training up institutions and supporting institutions to become more effective, preparing students to be development practitioners. As somebody was telling me last night, agricultural graduates driving Ubers, that's not the best use of people with those sorts of skills. So I guess it brings us back to leadership. Like, why aren't universities being incentivized
to play a greater role in food systems transformation. And I think it's, you know, the key word is incentivize. So resources are really important. So governments need to recognize their role. You know, I think actually the United States has been it is actually a very successful example of that. Like the land grant colleges and other universities in the US have long been the vehicles of agriculture and food systems change in America. I think there's just much more that can be done here. Governments are strapped for funds, of course. Donors can step in and help bridge those gaps. I think going back to, you know, partnerships between universities in the North and the South is a good model. I think that was sort of very popular in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, but maybe not so common these days. So I think there's a lot that can be done, but the sort of things that your projects and programs are doing, I think we should all be trying to find space for that, you know, to make sure they're really part of that, you know, they're really agents of transformation along with the others.
My name is Tiffany. I have several questions, if that's okay.
Several, okay.
Several. So I currently work with an organization that works with women in Kenya, and one of their focuses is sustainable aquaculture, specifically on Lake Victoria. One of the problems that those areas face is intense flooding, a whole lot of flooding, which limits their agricultural land. And then in other seasons, they cannot fish. The fish are dying. There's a lot of problems with how much fish they can get, and then also how far they have to go to get the actual fish. And so I'm wondering, with your model of increasing yield or expanding agricultural land, how would you respond or theorize about a problem like that? Yes.
So I didn't hear the first, but you said aquaculture, right?
Sustainable
fish-
aquaculture,
Is
fishing.
fish farming in Lake
Yeah.
Victoria, is
Yeah.
it? Yeah. Okay, and what you're saying is there's a lot of runoff and issues basically coming from the land itself.
Yes,
Yeah.
from the land, from the water.
The land and the water, yeah, because I do recall I was involved in some of those projects in Western Kenya, and in fact, the major source of phosphorus entering into Lake Victoria was urban runoff, not agriculture. It was flowing from Kisumu and places like that. So it's not just about agriculture. Agriculture is part of that, but you know, it's very much you know, what I was arguing about intensification, that you don't go into those, you know, very hilly areas surrounding Lake Victoria and go plowing up that land and throwing lots of inputs into that land. And, you know, even if you get a bit more maize production there, the downstream consequences are, you know, are awful. So we need to develop better land management systems across that whole, you know, the whole watershed, and not just the Kenyan side, but the other areas that are feeding into Lake Victoria. So this is a case where I think the knowledge is there. What we need to do is provide the necessary incentives for farmers to adopt that knowledge, you know, so contour farming, conservation farming with zero or minimum tillage, crop rotations where you keep your cover on the land the whole time. You know, most of the year you need to have a crop cover. So there's many things. Sometimes it's called regenerative agriculture, but you know, it doesn't mean don't use any external inputs, but you use them much more wisely than you have in the past. There's another aspect to that too, is that, you know, somehow there needs to be some compensation for people who are suffering the consequences of actions done upstream. Now, those mechanisms have been discussed for a long time. They're very hard to implement. They're difficult to implement, but the idea of, at a minimum, compensating
farmers to change their practices, even if they don't necessarily see the benefits of it immediately. But if it's resulting in better results downstream, including down in your aquaculture areas, then I think they're the kind of novel approaches to rural transformation that are necessary. Beyond that, I don't have necessarily answers. I'm not an aquaculture person, but what the challenges that the people that you're working with are facing are not unusual. They tend to be at the, if it's not the aquaculture folks, it's the farmers right at the mouth of the valley that tend to suffer the most in terms of flooding and siltation and rising sea levels and so on that affect them, particularly in coastal areas. So,
Yeah,
what's
and
your
it's their ancestral land as well, so there's a big ownership part
Yeah.
of it. My second question had to do with healthy diets and what is a healthy diet, and does it include areas of the world or areas of a country that might have different needs? For example, if I'm from an area of Kenya that has autoimmune diseases, how does the definition of a healthy diet change for me? Or is that not a thing yet?
No, I think a healthy diet's a healthy diet is fundamental in terms of the nutrients that you need for for your body to grow and develop and your mind to develop. There are a set of core nutrients that are needed by the body. I'm not a nutritionist, but take a look at that chapter in my book, which really goes into detail about the different nutrients that are important. Now, we get most of our nutrients from food, right? So the idea is having a healthy diet often means having a diverse diet, a balanced diet across, ensuring adequate calories, protein, and particularly micronutrients. When any of these are missing, you find you're going to have problems. Now, how do you do that is very contextual. It depends on many things. It depends on locally available foods. You saw my statistic there that, what was it? 900 million people in Africa cannot actually afford what we would describe as a healthy diet, based on a calculation of a basket of food products that you would need to consume for a healthy diet and the income that the population has to be able to buy that food. So that's really challenging. We have to make those foods more readily available to people, the diverse diets, and having a healthy diet. That's why having a healthy diet is something that you invest in. And it's not something that you just go around house to house and say, oh, you need to be eating more leafy vegetables, right? Or you need to be eating more meat or eggs or milk. Because people say, yeah, sure, but that's the most expensive stuff, right? The cheapest stuff is usually the calories. It's like, get your corn, get your rice. But unfortunately, those basic staples do not have the range of nutrients you need for a healthy diet. So again, it's very contextual, and it's also, you mentioned people with health issues. Age is another factor. The dietary requirements of children and adolescents and mothers and pregnant mothers and pregnant women and mothers, and there's different requirements for all of them. But the sad thing is we're falling short pretty much across the board. So it's one of the great challenges to be able to come up with dietary guidelines. That's great, but then actually implementing such programs. And as I said, that's why I have social protection there as well, because for some people, they'll never have the money to be able to buy a healthy diet. So whether it's through school meals or voucher programs and other types of systems that give people the opportunity to consume a better diet. Even if it's not a perfect diet, there are ways of reducing those negative effects. And I was only talking about undernutrition, not the overnutrition part, which is, you know, it's increasingly evident in the world and in Africa, and especially in urban areas, but not only in urban areas. Oh, I think it does. I think it affects, I think it, we have a number of areas. Now, you're talking broadly about SEPA, okay? Oh, the MPADP. Well, what we do is, the way the program's organized is we have some core components of economics and statistics and sort of basic development practice / management approaches that are pretty much relevant to any field that you want to work in. So these fundamentals are, you know, essential whether you're going to find yourself working in aquaculture or renewable energy or educational reforms or any of these areas. So as I was saying, we end up having students from a very wide range of topics. I've just talked a lot about agriculture and food today because that's my particular area. But I would say out of 50 students in every cohort, probably, I don't know, 7 or 8 might be sort of headed in that sort of ag, food, nutrition area. The other 40 or so, you know, they may touch on it, and, you know, there's very few fields that don't interface with the food system in some ways, health in particular, right? Health and education, infrastructure. I mean, all these things, they're all related. And I think that's the real point, that we're happy for you to come into the program and specialize, like take us, you know, dive deep into a topic, but make sure, and we make sure, that you see the connections between the, you know, the area that you're working on and all the other pieces out there, from sort of macroeconomic policy all the way through to, you know, energy use and food security, as I talked about. So, yeah, I think and again, it's also one where if you're entrepreneurial, if you have a bit of an entrepreneurial spirit and you want to sort of create your own space, we provide a lot of space for that to happen. And there are all kinds of interesting project activities that you can get involved with. You know, for 3 months between first and second year, students have a requirement to go out and work in an organization that they're interested in and build some experience, expertise, and exposure to an area that they might not have ever worked in before. We have a capstone project at the end of second year where students work in teams, basically consulting for a client, and getting, you know, more and more experience of delivering, you know, outcomes, products that the client wants. So lots of space for you to be creative. And as I say, to sort of build your profile. We want you to come in as a student, anybody listening who's a potential student, we really do want you to have a minimum of 2 years experience. We've made a few exceptions in the past, but not many. But coming in with some work experience is really useful. But you don't have to necessarily continue in that field. Some people have shifted directions. They've sort of turned right or left. They were in the public sector and they wanted to move more into the private sector and entrepreneurial side. So there's lots of space over a 2-year period to sort of find yourself and reshape your profile for the years ahead. Yes.
Hello. Thanks. Also, I'm not a plant for Glenn, but I am an alumna of the program. And I think another real advantage of the program is the ability to take classes from other schools within Columbia. So if you're interested in education or public health, the ability to cross-register and take courses from the other schools was really helpful for me in what I was interested in studying. But I do have a question, which is, Going back to your kind of 5 component model of a sustainable food system, you had that sort of 6th component of the cross-cutting investments. And I think the ones that you mentioned were, investments in education and women's rights and that sort of thing, but also but you also kind of put conflict and climate change in there as well. So I would think of those as not only sort of investments, but also potentially spoilers of kind of a sustainable food system. So I guess I'm curious, in countries where there does not exist national capacity or national willingness to actually implement your 5 components, I'm thinking DR Congo, Sudan, are you seeing sort of the primary levers for change to be at the international or the kind of regional level, or at the grassroots level? And sort of how would you kind of adapt your model in contexts where that kind of national, where the government might be sort of actively starving its own people in some cases, in the worst cases?
Yeah, no, that's the most difficult. That's the most difficult question to answer. Is like, how do you deal with in conflict settings? Basically, when there are bullets flying around, how do you deal, even when that's not the case, but where you have very repressive regimes that do not care necessarily about some segments of the population. So we've got all of those, by the way, not just in Africa, all over the world, all right? And we clearly in recent 2 years, we've been sort of really challenged to thinking about the crisis in Gaza, for example. What do you do? What can you do in that setting? People are literally starving. There's famine. The real official definition of famine is there. So it's kind of out of, I generally accept that that's out of my area of expertise. I think the first thing, you have to stop the fighting. It's, of course, find ways to get trucks of food in to keep people alive. If I'm going to prioritize anything, you say, what's your priority? How do you prioritize? The first priority is to keep people alive. That should be the first priority, because when that doesn't succeed, that's irreversible. You can't bring them back to life later. So keep people alive. And that's why in transforming the food system, my first priority is to, like, people suffering severe acute malnutrition, like the types of malnutrition that are very commonly associated with conflict and severe droughts, that sort of situation. We need the infrastructure, the institutions, the capacity, and frankly, it's usually not possible within, and a very important role of international organizations to make that happen. So that's number one. Second thing is, second priority for me is always to, beyond what I just mentioned, deal with problems that are essentially irreversible, like stunting. Stunting is largely irreversible. The impact that stunting has on children during those first 1,000 days from conception to 2 years old, the damage done to the brain at that point is you're pretty much stuck with that. So and I've got a nutritionist here who could tear me down if necessary, but that's certainly what my nutritionist friends have told me. Yes, there are, humans have wonderful ways of compensating. And so lots of kids who've been stunted have gone on and lived healthy and productive lives, but on average, they don't, right? On average, they don't. So, getting into those places and saying it's completely unacceptable to have stunting levels of 30%, let alone 58%, So that's super important. Biodiversity loss, just to sort of switch it beyond the humanitarian side. Biodiversity is another thing. Extinction of species is something you can't
it seems like we can't bring them back to life. So these are really important. I would then invest in things that for where there are multiplier effects. So things like, you know, education and health. School meal programs has great multiplier effects. It improves education, it improves nutrition. It doesn't deal really with stunting, but it deals with improved nutrition, education performance. If you connect it to farmers, basically it can give markets for farmers if it's done properly. So there's all sorts of interesting, you know, priorities we could do there. But, you know, this fundamental, I'm so happy that in the SDGs, SDG 16, you know, if you believe in goals, at least at the global level, it was great initiative of one little country called Timor-Leste, who insisted and built a very nice coalition of fragile nations to support the idea of SDG 16, with the idea that fragile nations, particularly countries coming out of conflict, had very special needs, had needs that weren't evident in many countries who had not had the same kind of experience. So that's important. It doesn't necessarily mean actions are taken, but it's better to have it than not to have it. But I think we've just got to work much, much harder to, you know, just bring people to their senses that conflict has there's no good outcome to conflict. You know, we've got to get, I think we've got to get the different parties in these conflicts to realize, to give them a vision of a better future. That's what I've, you know, that's my solution for Gaza. You know, that's my, you know, that the future has to be positive for people to want to lay down their arms and try to live a better life. But you have to present that to them. You can't really do that with guns. And you know, I've been looking at Haiti, I've been looking at Myanmar, I've been looking at different sort of parts of the world where there've been these conflicts, and you know, I can't be critical because I've not been inside, you know, the machinery that is trying to solve those conflicts, but I still wonder why we can't do much better in incentivizing the combatants to see a better future by laying their arms down and, you know, and doing things differently. I've got a couple of questions here online. Are there scholarship opportunities for potential students? So I did mention one scholarship opportunity, which was the Joint Japan World Bank Scholarship Program. It's obviously a very competitive program. There are certain restrictions, but actually most low middle income countries are included. So go to the website of the Joint Japan World Bank Scholarship Program, and you'll see all the conditions. I think you have to have worked in the public sector for at least a couple of years and this sort of thing. So there's a few requirements in terms of age and everything else, but very much worthwhile. And every year out of our 50 students, last couple of years, I think we've had 2 or 3 of our students come in on these scholarship programs. Now, there are others out there. There are Fulbright programs. There are you know, different embassies and donor agencies have their own scholarship programs. SEPA does have a scholarship program in the sense that we have some funds that we can allocate to our students to reduce the cost of tuition. Tuition is very high. We accept that. You know, I don't set the tuition. All I can do is tell you that we'll give you the best possible program for that money. But there are scholarship programs, and so if you do apply to the DP program or any SEPA program, do so within if you go to the deadlines, there's one deadline for consideration for scholarships, so make sure you apply by then. Even better, there's a deadline for what they call early action. And frankly, that sends a nice signal to us when somebody is organized enough to submit their
application by the early action deadline, we tend to think they're pretty well organized, and they will probably be well organized also in undertaking a program. So that probably slightly increases their opportunities for getting a SEPA scholarship, but it certainly doesn't guarantee it, because there just isn't that much money to go around. But yes, there's a fair bit of assistance. And once you come to SEPA, there are other opportunities there to kind of supplement your income through becoming a teaching assistant, becoming a program assistant. These are sort of part-time roles of 10 to up to 20 hours per week, where you can supplement your funding there. So there are different ways of doing it. Some governments, some host governments, or some like government of Indonesia, I know, and other governments have particular programs that you can apply for from that country to come to Colombia, to come to SEPA, come to the DP program. So there's a few opportunities out there. Will you share the slides? Absolutely. So how do you want to do it? I'm happy to. You can just turn it into a PDF, and people can have it. There's nothing confidential, or I want more. But as I said, it's in the book. If you can beg, borrow, and I won't say steal the book, get it if you can. And if you write me a really nice letter, if you happen to be listening out there today and you write me a really nice letter and tell me why it's useful to you, I'll make sure you get the book, okay? Good. All right. Any last, how are we doing for time? Still okay? No? Any more online? Would you like to ask a question?
No, it's okay. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Glenn. I had a question about the example you gave about Malawi and President Mutharika, the late President Mutharika, and his initiative to increase food production. The interesting thing coming out of that is working at cross purposes with the donors. So the donors didn't think his initiative would work, it's not sustainable, and so on. How do we get governments and donors to be on the same page so that, we're doing what is right by the people?
Yeah. Where do I start? I think the all the rhetoric is there. Like, we've had all kinds of conferences and commitments, and by the UN, even if you read the SDGs, if you go through the Agenda 2030, the 2030 agenda, it's very clear that it's the governments of these countries are meant to take the lead in this. I think it takes people like Mutharika and other leaders, and I can name another one that I think is quite exceptional for that, and that is President Kagame in Rwanda, who has basically told the donors what their role is for a long time, and I think to some extent Tanzania has done that as well, and donors have rallied behind Tanzania pretty impressively over the years, and there are good development outcomes as a result of that. But I think it starts with national leadership. I could give you some, I won't, but I could give you some terrible anecdotes of where there was shocking bullying by donors saying, you don't do this, we cut the funds, and I'm not talking corruption, I'm talking, we don't like that priority, we like this priority because that's what our constituents back in whatever country, that's what we want to see. So
it takes a lot of skill. I mean, I don't envy our national leaders here because they need the money. They need the money. But at the same time, I think it's important that they demonstrate that they have the political will and the capacity and at least some track record to be able to demonstrate, why their priorities are important. I think, I've seen too many situations where they're sort of throwing stones at each other. In some cases, it's true. I mean, there have been some very dysfunctional governments over the years that I can understand why. We've got to understand that there are self-interests here. Donors have their self-interests too. Don't forget that. They are representing generally their own taxpayers. They're reporting to a minister who's elected by a population who may not have a clue what's important out in this part of the world, right? So I think all of us as leaders have to continue to educate, both the governments, the host governments where we're working or working in even, and with the so-called development partners to sort of bring them, to make them more aligned for a common purpose. Having good results on the ground is really helpful, documenting those results. There's so many people who get up and say, completely with lack of knowledge, Africa is a disaster. Agriculture is not moving. Everyone's malnourished. I mean, you can see there are several indications there, several positive indications we need to build on. There's a lot of hope in terms of agricultural productivity improvement, in terms of actually seeming to reduce dependency on food imports. There's definitely improvements in nutrition, but it's simply not happening fast enough. I don't think enough people know these positive stories out there. So I think good communication to demonstrate, hey, aid done well can really have a huge impact, a very positive impact.
Yes, so thank you so very much for your presentation. My name is Albert Migoa. I'm a counseling psychologist. So for me, this has been more of an information session for me. I'm learning about food security, and I think it is very, very key. So my question is linked to mental health. So my question to you is this: have you delved into the psychological impact of food security? So in this context, maybe you look at what's the psychological impact of undernutrition or overnutrition? What are we doing in as far as non-communicable diseases are concerned? Have you looked at the impact of support groups of persons with non-communicable diseases? And if so, what has the impact been?
Right. Did you say the predicate of that was mental health?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
I'll be honest, I have not. I've not worked on that area, but there are organizations and individuals who are keenly aware of that, and not least in these post-conflict settings, people who've been displaced and who've suffered genocide and other kind of traumatic experiences. I think universal food security, in my view, is sort of a set of ethics, really, that says that nobody should be left behind. And so we can talk about gender, we can talk about the elderly, the particular needs of elderly people. We can talk about the marginalized, we can talk about people living with disabilities, with
chronic health issues, and for me, mental health issues are a part of that. They're widespread in rural and urban areas. So I think it's an interesting potential topic to sort of tease out. Are there any unique opportunities for improving food security, nutrition, quality of life, for people with mental challenges? So absolutely. It is indeed one of the consequences of stunting, that people will more likely than not experience those challenges later in life and be less able to cope with them. So I just encourage you to stay on that, if you're interested in that area, to stay with it. And if there's some way, if you want to connect with me, and if I can do a little research through the contacts that I have, maybe there are some folks out there who, whose work might be of use to you. Thanks. Shall we make this the last question? Okay. So yeah, so there's we get this sometimes. So as a Kenyan applicant to CEPA, there's an application fee. Is it $100? How much is it? $100 or so dollars. Can you get a waiver for it? Generally, the bureaucrat answer to that one, which I'm not much of a bureaucrat, the bureaucrat answer is that if you can't afford the $100, you're going to have a hard time mobilizing the money to pay for the degree. Now, I think, yeah, that's a bit harsh in a way, because I think many of you are being smart in actually trying to apply for a number of places. And if you're shelling out $50, $100, $200 to different organizations, that ends up being quite a lot of money that you're potentially going to be wasting. We do have ways, if there's a genuine, if you have a genuine reason not to be able to pay that application fee, you can make a request for a waiver. It does exist, and we have ways of accepting that. So please, if it is a genuine concern for the person who wrote this or who said this, just include that in your application, not your application materials, in your correspondence with admissions.
Have a seat so we will now conclude our event here. For our audience who are online, we thank you for joining us. Look out for the recording of this event. It will be online soon, so that you can interact with it and actually even get the contacts for Glenn and others, and reach out for if you have any more questions. So at this point, we will sign out from the online. And for the audience here, we do have a small reception next door that you can join us for as you network. Welcome. Thank you.